The Romans were fanatic about their games. You might think that modern sports fans are crazy, but at their height, the Roman games took up half the year. On their part, the emperors were always ready to empty the coffers for just one more round of spectacles. But what was in it for them? Was it really some sinister scheme for control of the people, what we'd perhaps call bread and circuses? Or is that just us projecting our anxieties onto the Romans? The phrase bread and circuses originated in the 10th satire of the Roman poet Juvenal, who wrote this: "But what about the mob of Remus? They follow fortune, as always, and hate the condemned. The same people, if Nausea had favoured that Etruscan, if the emperor's long life had been snuffed out at unawares, would be proclaiming Sejanus as Augustus within the hour. Long ago, since when we have sold our votes to nobody, they gave up their responsibilities, for they who had once bestowed high command, authority, the legions, everything, now make themselves tame, and pine anxiously for two things only, bread and circuses." This passage follows Juvenal's description of the downfall of Sejanus, Tiberius's praetorian prefect and de facto master of Rome. The satire centres around the idea that people's desires are ultimately destructive. Sejanus prayed for power and got so much that it brought about his downfall. The same goes for the mob of Remus, who got the easy lifestyle they wanted at the cost of becoming powerless, and thus, to Juvenal, they are not even worthy of being called the stock of Romulus. While to Juvenal, bread and circuses might have been about the demise of the people by their own short-sightedness, the average Twitter user thinks differently about it and focuses on two ideas. One, that bread and circuses is used to distract and depoliticize the masses, and two, that bread and circuses is a sign of societal decay. Though people often tout that everything in the modern world is like 1984, the real anxiety seems to be that our society is becoming something like Huxley's Brave New World. Information isn't hidden, but people are so consumed by their own desires that they don't care to seek it out at all. So before I go any further, I want to dispel this popular conception. In the interest of not ballooning the length of this video, I'll focus on the Roman Empire and not the Republic. The simpler myth to bust is that bread and circuses reflected the decay of the Roman state. There is no correlation between Rome's decline and the rise of the games, let alone causation. Under Marcus Aurelius, 135 days were dedicated to public games, much higher than the 66 of Augustus's era, yet nobody will claim that the empire was in decline under the so-called good emperors. And the idea of depoliticization and distraction is one great anachronism. For in the modern day, we are indeed distracted from distraction by distraction, but the Roman people couldn't be distracted from what they couldn't know anyway. Anonymous political pamphlets were banned, problematic writings were burned, and the Senate proceedings ceased to be published. There was general news, called the Acta Diurna, but the government censored its contents. This meant that the plebs had a very limited awareness of government policy and didn't need to be distracted. Unsurprisingly, these cliches don't cut it as an explanation. To really understand bread and circuses, we have to explore the relationship between the emperor and the people. The emperors possessed a cult of personality. Since the plebs are mostly ignorant of imperial policy, the emperors didn't have to worry about popular opinion as long as they were popular. It's not a perfect analogy, but imagine it like how Catholics traditionally thought about the Pope. Since people expected their sovereign to be virtuous, the emperors had to play the part. Liberalitas, or generosity, was one of the key virtues that the emperors emphasized in themselves, and it appeared prominently on imperial coinage. And nothing advertised liberalitas better than a bunch of free spectacles. The emperor held a monopoly on this kind of munificence in the capital. The provincial aristocracy could engage in their own local munificence with the symbolic consent of the emperor, but Rome was the emperor's city. This weakened the traditional senatorial elite, who could no longer promote themselves through lavish benefactions in the capital. But Rome was not just the capital, it was the heart of the empire. The emperor's benefactions established a visible relationship between the people of the capital and the emperor. Rome functioned like an enormous royal court, projecting the emperor's opulence and virtue to the entire empire and to posterity. But there is another level to this public persona just beyond granting the games. The emperors must attend them. Even Marcus Aurelius, who bemoaned the monotony of the games, made sure to show up. The emperors were performers just as much as any gladiator or charioteer. To understand how much the Caesar's conduct at the games was scrutinised, it's Suetonius' time to shine. He reports that the people resented how Julius Caesar would spend his time reading through letters and petitions instead of actually watching the games. Learning from this, the first emperor Augustus would always give his full attention to the games, and if he could not attend, would excuse himself and appoint another official on his behalf. On the other hand, Tiberius provided very few games, and thus Suetonius labelled him as a cheapskate. Meanwhile, Caligula was a little too involved in the games. Suetonius writes this: "After inviting Ptolemy to come from his kingdom and receiving him with honour, he suddenly had him executed for no other reason than that when giving a gladiatorial show, he noticed that Ptolemy, on entering the theatre, attracted general attention by the splendour of his purple cloak. When an Aesedarius called Porreus was vigorously applauded on the day of one of the games for setting his slave free after a victory, Caligula rushed from the amphitheatre in such haste that he trod on the fringe of his toga and went headlong down the steps, fuming and shouting, 'The people that rule the world give more honour to a gladiator for a trifling act than to their deified emperors, or to the one still present with them.'" Looking past the theatrics of Suetonius' account, we can see that Caligula clearly understood the importance of the games for its popularity. Indeed, Suetonius' interest in the behaviour of the Caesars at the games is evidence for how important they were for communicating imperial virtue, even to the supposedly aloof senatorial class. This might give a picture of the games as entirely apolitical, but that is far from the truth. Even in the late days of the Republic, Cicero noted that the will of the people could be heard just as clearly at the games as at the assemblies, and once the assemblies lost their power, the games became the avenue for the plebs to make their demands. Sometimes these were more trifling matters, like freeing a lion trainer or moving a statue, but hefty political action was demanded too. The people protested about the skyrocketing price of grain under Tiberius and Caligula's excessive taxes. Perhaps the climax of this tradition was reached in the reign of Justinian, where his refusal to pardon 2 partisans of the chariot factions led to a week-long insurrection that nearly cost him his crown. While the occasional emperor like Tiberius thought the games were too much trouble to be worth it, most saw the value in putting on a populist face and appeasing the crowd. Now you might think I've forgotten about the bread bit of bread and circuses, but I promise I haven't. But before we get to the motivations behind it, it's worth establishing what the system of grain distribution actually looked like. It is true that the emperors distributed free grain, though it was only to 200,000 citizens of the million inhabitants of the city. More broadly, the imperial government supervised the entire grain market through a system called the cura annoni. The most important agricultural provinces of the empire were Africa and Egypt, though eventually the Egyptian grain would be diverted to Constantinople. How much the government directly controlled the grain trade is immensely disputed and is caught up amongst the academic debate over the nature of the ancient economy, but generally the government's intervention shifted slowly from ad hoc measures to extensive oversight. The interests of the emperors in the grain market and the grain dole were both ideological and practical. In the ancient economy, where transport costs were so great, price stability was unlikely without imperial intervention. Now, behind this concern for the price of bread was the looming threat of bread riots, the most frequent type of riot in Roman history. Suetonius attributes Claudius's attentions to the grain supply to his close shave with a mob that pelted him with stale bread. But ideologically, the grain dole functioned like the emperor's other acts of munificence. Since Roman citizens were the sole privileged recipients, it affirmed the status of Rome as the greatest city of the empire, while also further affirming the emperor's liberalitas. So in the end, bread and circuses was not about depoliticization, but about ideology. Though the emperors profited from this relationship with the people, they couldn't dictate the terms entirely. Particularly in the West, we have a tendency to look to the Romans for lessons about our own society, forgetting how different they were from us. How we imagine the Romans, though sometimes far removed from real Roman society, can nevertheless tell us a lot about ourselves. Si discere de Romanis utis, subscribite, valete amici, et gratias vobis ago, quod Romanitatem vidistis.